Buenos días. Bueno, creo que ya podemos empezar la presentación. Bienvenidos todos a una nueva sesión de los webinars de la colaboración Cochrane Colombia. Mi nombre es Martín Cañón, soy el jefe del Centro de Investigación de la Clínica en Manaco, afiliada como centro a Cochrane Colombia. Hoy tendremos una invitada especial internacional, la doctora Lesley Uttley. Ella es Senior Research Fellow del Centro de Investigación en Salud eh, y temas relacionados de Sheffield. Es profesora de la Escuela de Medicina y Salud Poblacional de la Universidad de Sheffield. Su formación académica es en psicología, tiene un doctorado en, en psicología y nos va a presentar su charla titulada Más problemas con las revisiones sistemáticas, actualizaciones sobre una iniciativa viva de integridad investigativa para revisiones sistemáticas. Dr. Uttley, on behalf of Clínica en Manaco and Cochrane Colombia, we thank you for accepting our invitation to participate in the webinar. It's an honor and a privilege having you here. Regarding the topic of your presentation, research sites, universities here in Colombia are building capacity, research capacity, are building research culture, and we know research integrity is at the core of research culture. We also know that there's an upsurge of systematic review publications, mostly in Asia, China, that, well, at least in my experience, do not live up to quality standards in many cases. And these systematic reviews are informing clinical practice guidelines in countries and regions. We hope your presentation could help us reflect on our own research practices and motivate research integrity initiative here in both in Colombia or in Latin America that, as far as I know, it doesn't exist. So thank you again, Dr. Uttley. The floor is yours. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you for inviting me and for the opportunity to speak about this. Apologies that I have to do the talk in English. I can report that the weather here is cloudy and grey in the United Kingdom, which is standard for our British summertime. So I'd like to report on some of the updates of this living review of the problems with systematic reviews, but I will begin with what we have originally intended to do. So an overview of the project and its methods and its intentions. And then I'll just go on to what the most recent updates are from this review now that we've done an update, and how research culture is likely contributing to a lot of the problems that we're seeing in systematic reviews, and also what are the potential solutions that we can all think about in order to improve the quality of systematic reviews over time, and some other related interesting work in this field that I'm working on. So this research is funded by the UK Medical Research Council, and it is a Career Development Award to investigate human influences in systematic reviews and meta-analyses. My background is actually in psychology, so I've always been interested in how the humans that come to research projects influence them and what are the biases. One of the things that you do get taught in psychology is how to do a fair test. And a systematic review is supposed to be a fair test of the evidence base in the same way that a randomized controlled trial is supposed to be the fairest test of clinical trials. But the views are my own and not necessarily representative of the Medical Research Council. So just to start off with, although the connotations of my work are negative because I'm focusing on the problems, I do believe that systematic reviews are the best way to assess the evidence from multiple sources when they're done well. Also, I'm not an ad hominem researcher. I don't ever intend to criticize individuals or teams or institutions. The aim of this work is to encourage everybody to reflect on their own research practices in order to improve future conduct. So as much as I enjoy Retraction Watch, people don't need to fear that they're going to have their pictures up on the screen for any systematic review errors that they may have made. So many of you will be familiar with the fact that systematic reviews are at the pinnacle of the evidence-based hierarchy and regarded as the gold standard in evidence synthesis. But I had been working in the field of systematic reviews for about 10 years, working as a systematic reviewer, as a peer reviewer, as a journal editor, and also as the lead of an evidence review group for UK NICE, which is the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence. And I was seeing increasing examples of poorly conducted systematic reviews being submitted to me. So frequently I would see whole teams of psychotherapists or physiotherapists, homeopathists, reviewing their very own interventions, but declaring that they have no conflicts, not pre-registering. So with systematic reviews, you can register after the fact. You kind of already have begun the process of selecting studies and data extraction. You can then go on to obtain a post hoc registration number. You wouldn't be able to get away with that in clinical trials, so I'm not too sure why we accept that for systematic reviews. Massaging data with meta-analysis using different combinations of studies to find an interesting treatment effect, or unduly highlighting favourable studies that are included within the review and ignoring negative ones, and adding a spin in the conclusions just to make that very long systematic review product a little bit more interesting at the end. And these are not new problems, but we're still not very good at looking at who is the team that's conducting the review, what's their motive for conducting the review, and how are they hoping to influence the evidence base. And a bad systematic review is worse than just an editorial or a literature review because it claims to have this level of scientific integrity, which is often absent. So when I began preparing this fellowship application and looking at different studies that were highlighting problems in systematic reviews, I could see that there was a lot of work already in this space, but in different journals, in different clinical specialities, and the work was often not joined up, not aware of other research in the field. And also, we have many guidelines for systematic reviews, be they reporting guidelines or methodological guidelines. But despite the innovations in these and the many extensions there are and different iterations to these guidelines, I wasn't personally seeing the quality of systematic reviews being submitted to me improving over time. So the aim of this work has been to conduct a living systematic review, which assesses all that evidence, which is highlighting problems with published systematic reviews to really see what are these problems and how often are they being cited as being problems. And I decided that a living review was better, not merely because of the amount of evidence that I was seeing, but it's a very fast emerging topic. There's a lot being published in this space, and a living review is a good way to see how trends are emerging over time. So the front end of this review is a website, which is at systematicrevolution.com. And you can go to the framework of problems and see how they're organized. And you can see all the papers that are included under each problem. But the main academic output has been a paper in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. So behind that website is a relational database, which I use to extract data and store the studies. And there is a web application, which myself and collaborators can input data on in real time. And that is uploaded live to the website. So this project was registered with the Open Science Framework before I started, and it was also registered on Prospero. That is becoming increasingly difficult with projects like mine, as it's more of a methodological than a health-related problem. But my argument is that if the methods of the systematic reviews are not up to scratch, it does affect the health outcomes reported in those systematic reviews. So it does have a direct impact on patient care. So the general overarching principle in terms of the eligibility for this review are that the included articles need to be finding problems with published systematic reviews. So articles that talk about problems that could happen in theory, but they don't give any examples, they don't cite any examples of where it's happened in published systematic reviews, wouldn't be included. Also, I wouldn't include studies that criticize meta-analyses, which don't claim to have been conducted in the context of a systematic review. And there are a lot more of those than there are ones that are simply criticizing systematic reviews. So I'm really only taking those absolutely highest standards, creme de la creme articles which claim to be systematic reviews. So the literature searches from the first iteration resulted in a roughly 10,000 citations, after which filtering out studies that were not relevant resulted in 485 included papers which found problems with published systematic reviews. 485 papers. Okay, so within those 485 papers, some of them will have been finding problems with maybe just one or a few systematic reviews. This diagram plots the number of systematic reviews that were being studied on a logarithmic scale. So we can see that there are a majority of papers which included between 10 and hundreds of systematic reviews, right up to some papers that were finding problems in tens of thousands of systematic reviews. So boiling all those 485 studies down, I did a thematic analysis to combine what problems are they talking about? And I semantically coded those problems. And I found that the problems fall into one of four domains. They were either talking about how comprehensive a systematic review is and that it doesn't miss relevant studies. Whether it is rigorous and uses the best practice methods available for systematic reviews that we expect, whether it's reported in a way that would enable people to replicate the review and it's transparent. And the last domain, which is probably less covered by the guidelines, is whether the review is done objectively and without conflicts of interest or other influences or lack of influences from the people who are doing the review. So when you take a look at the problems to do with how comprehensive review is, it often centers around the literature searches of those reviews and how much trouble the reviews have taken to make sure that they really have conducted the most inclusive searches that they can to make sure that they don't miss any relevant studies. And then problems of rigor are to do with how the review is conducted methodologically, and that might be to do with the statistical choices within the review, or whether or not they do or incorporate risk of bias into the review, or whether quality is even mentioned at all, because quality appraisal is sort of discrete to risk of bias. Some reviews talk about quality, some talk about risk of bias, some do not mention it whatsoever. They just talk about treatment effects. And then transparency is how well a review is reported in terms of what the motivations were for it, but also how it's described to enable another team to come along, replicate that review, and see if they can find the same findings as the original systematic review. And then some of the problems to do with how objective a review is are the decisions made by the review team, and also the composition of the review team, whether they didn't include a second author to double check things, whether they didn't consult with an information specialist to make sure that the searches were comprehensive, whether they assessed the evidence but they didn't bother to look at certainty or trying to understand the meta biases of the evidence base. So every included article, all 485 studies, were assigned a few keywords to denote the general clinical area and the methodological issues that were coming up. So this word cloud shows the most frequently occurring keywords. Now, as you can see, Cochrane jumps out there, and also general medical. And that is because if somebody wants to criticize systematic reviews, it's very easy to pick on Cochrane reviews because you can get a sample of systematic reviews very easily simply by going to the Cochrane database of systematic reviews and just taking a sample of those without doing any particularly sophisticated searches. The other thing that people tend to do is they will look at high impact journals such as the Lancet, BMJ, and they will look at anything that describes itself as a systematic review in those. So again, you get a very neat sample of systematic reviews from across the medical literature. But you can see other words that are cropping up quite frequently to do with publication bias, risk of bias. Now, I have just gotten round to completing the first update to those searches, and so that includes the literature period of May 22 to May of last year. There is quite a backlog because it takes quite a long time to do the searches and also to look at those literature. So just in that 1 year period, there are a further 152 included studies in the review, which shows that this is definitely an emerging field of research. And I have a new word cloud. So what I did do is I went back and I keyworded all the included articles, which were also picking holes in non-Cochrane reviews, just to add a little bit of context there, because I feel it was a little bit unfair to Cochrane. They were just a sitting duck, an easy target for people who want to poke holes in systematic reviews. And as you can see, non-Cochrane reviews are also very often studied. And whilst Cochrane reviews are frequently highlighted for having weaknesses, most head-to-head comparisons of Cochrane versus non-Cochrane reviews find Cochrane reviews to be higher methodological and reporting quality. But still, not without weaknesses. And you can read more about that if you look at the studies criticising Cochrane reviews on the website. Just a little few other little things to know. I mean, you could see back in the previous word cloud, there is a tiny little COVID word in between there, and then that's jumped to being quite big on this word cloud, showing some of the themes that are emerging. Some of the other new emerging keywords were to do with living, immunology. But the main finding in this update has been that a new problem has emerged. There are a handful of studies that have found that there is a lack of diversity in review authorship teams. And what this means that is often whole review teams comprised of males or white males even, just showing a lack of diversity in those review teams. And I have coded that problem under the domain of objectivity. So in other research, we see that secondary research, which would include things like systematic reviews, outpaces primary research, particularly in some countries, as Martin alluded to. There, China is quite a prolific producer, but not as much as the USA when it comes to systematic reviews. But also, as I mentioned before, the proliferation of meta-analyses which have not even been pre-specified or pre-registered or conducted in any kind of a systematic review is really exploding, especially from China. And I would argue that a meta-analysis that has not been entirely comprehensive and transparent about its eligibility criteria shouldn't be trusted. And I would be very happy if one thing to come out of this review is that people would stop doing those and certainly stop publishing them. So I'm not the only one in this field that is finding all these problems in systematic reviews. And the idea of this research integrity initiative is to join up that conversation so that we can learn about the problems with systematic reviews. But why is this happening? Why are these high quality, highly esteemed articles being produced? I would argue that research culture is a likely contributor to the problems that we're seeing. So, research culture, when you ask researchers, what are the words that comes to mind as a researcher, as an academic, when it comes to the research environment? The words that actually come up are quite negative about being competitive, about being pressured, about insecure research contracts. And ideally, when you ask people what they would like research culture to look like, they would like it to be diverse, collaborative, supportive. And this goes to show that the way that we often feel working in research is very different to how it would be ideally. And I would argue that a lot of this is due to researcher assessment and the fact that publications are the main currency that help researchers get contract security, to get promoted, to get tenure. Another problem with that is that journals like to publish novel findings, they publish for profit. Often this leads to research being behind a paywall, or article processing fees are passed on to researchers. It can lead to researchers feeling pressured to participate in questionable research practice in order to generate those papers. And that has an impact on the research that we're seeing. So when we think about the general inquiry cycle for how we do research, we think of a hypothesis, we design the study, we conduct the study, collect the data, analyze it, interpret it, publish it, think about our next research question. How freely are we able to do this without worrying too much about producing that high impact journal paper at the end. In my view, a lot of questionable research practices happen at each stage of that cycle of scientific inquiry, often to do with whether we have some sort of allegiance, whether we are invested in the conclusion of the review, whether the conclusion will go on to inform what we do next, who we work with, whether it could inform a future trial, whether you're making a conclusion that's palatable to a journal. Journals like to have a headline, something exciting, something novel, something new, something groundbreaking to report. Systematic reviews often have quite vague conclusions, and they're often not as exciting as they ought to be. I think systematic reviews are quite a good litmus test for the evidence base. And if there are problems with the way that we do systematic reviews, there's definitely problems with the rest of research that is published. I think also paradoxically, it is because systematic reviews have such a high reputation that they are contributing so much to research waste because they are seen as an almost guaranteed for publication because of their reputation. And so I think that they are often conducted almost as an easy publication, an easy route to publication, and without appropriate planning, expertise, and methodological conduct. So that's focusing a lot on the negatives, but thinking about all those different problems that we see in systematic reviews, what are the solutions? When it comes to having comprehensive literature searches, I think apply that term of inclusivity not only to your literature searches, but to your team. You do need to make sure that you have appropriate methods experts who can perform literature searches, who can design literature searches and revisit them if there's a problem. If you're doing meta-analyses, you probably do need some statistical input in there. To make sure that your review question is important, you probably need some sort of public consultation or patient representative. You need to make sure that you have the appropriate content or topic or clinical expertise in the review team, or at least consulted by the review team. And you do need to revisit those searches if you're finding papers that have not come up in your literature searches. The guidelines are there, for example, Messier and Cochrane reviews and AmStar to really help reviewers to conduct a review according to best practice methods. There are also different iterations of PRISMA reporting guidelines that can guide you with methodological conduct as well. Ensuring that you do have that statistical expertise if you are going to be combining data quantitatively is also an issue of rigor. I think it's very important to say what you're going to do before you start to do it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to publish your protocol in an academic journal, but at the very least, you have to upload it to some sort of publicly accessible source, even if it was your web page. But ideally, you can create an open science framework page, or if your review is health related, you can register it on Prospero. Sticking to reporting guidelines such as PRISMA and making sure you adhere to any relevant extensions of those guidelines. Publishing the review regardless of whether the findings appear to be exciting or novel. And sharing your data to enable other people to reproduce your review if possible. And that's particularly important for reviews which are funded by publicly funded tax-paying research bodies. Having the appropriate research team to conduct a systematic review is probably one of the most overlooked categories. But I think in order to produce research for diverse populations, you do need a diverse research team. You need to make sure that the review team members are engaged in the review question. Not so much that they're invested in the outcome, but they're invested enough to ensure that the results are clinically meaningful. Taking the time to think about what are your own conflicts of interest and allegiances, and if you do have a conflict, you're probably not the best person to lead the review. And that doesn't mean that you don't bring a lot to the review question, but you just may not be best to make those critical decisions which can determine the outcome of a review, for example, including positive studies. And if there are conflicts in the team, how to manage them and ensure that those experts are not making those critical decisions also. Accountability and being reflexive on how when you've completed a review, you are the corresponding author of it. And if there are retracted studies or problems with it, then it's your job to update it so that it doesn't go on to influence further medical decisions if it is erroneous. So other things that are happening in the pipeline. I'm currently a guest editor for the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology on a special issue of related to research integrity and research culture. And for that, I have been performing a rapid review of research culture influences, and that really was inspired by this update that I've performed in seeing that a lot of the themes in the newly included papers relate to how reviews are being published, and not only how reviews are being published, but also the meta research studies that that critique them. So some other news. Originally, my award was due to expire at the end of this year, but I have a bit more funding to support the review living for a couple more years to the end of 2026, which I hope is good news for many. And it will enable the website to remain live and up to date until then. And I have a paper submitted, which I hope you'll all be able to access soon, which not only revisits some of the themes I've talked about here, but it also includes some new data on which of these problems have been investigated to find that they impact the conclusions. So which of these problems are the ones that we really need to worry about? So that's the objectives of the next work packages in this research. So thank you so much for listening. Apologies, it was a whistle-stop tour. I've just finished with a word cloud here of all the included authors. This is for authors who have written 2 or more. I think it might be even 3 studies, included studies in the review. As you can see, there are some that are much more prolific in this field than others. I thought that might be an interesting shot to end with. And if you've got any questions, I'd be really pleased to discuss them.
Thank you, Dr. Uttley, for your excellent presentation. Yes, we've got a couple of questions here in our chat. One of them is, how has AI affected these kind of reviews, systematic reviews? Has it been all positive for researchers and for
I would say that currently I haven't seen the impact of AI in reviews yet. But what I am seeing is a lot of papers talking about the use of AI. I'm seeing a lot of tools and proposed methods that are, implementing AI. We are not at a stage yet where we can say which are the best AI tools to use, but it's a fast emerging field. What we are seeing, though, is an increase in AI generated publications in general. So that is papers such as those produced by paper mills. So they are often fake data or highly modified, and they are sold to in return for authorship, and they are often generated with AI tools. So yeah, that's an issue which hasn't quite filtered yet into systematic revolution, but it's definitely one that I can see emerging in meta research.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. There's another question that I think is also very interesting. Regarding research integrity, the responsibility lies on institutions and research sites, or does it lie on journals that accept these kinds of, let's say, low quality systematic?
Everyone, I think it's very, very difficult, but there is responsibility all around. Institutions are responsible for providing these incentives and saying, you got to publish, you have to publish. This is how we get our reputation, this is how we get our funding. So, although we have the DORA principles and others, it really is yet to take an impact, and many people are still being judged on the number of publications. Journals, they have a responsibility in terms of how much do they want to always find the newest findings, or how much do they actually want to be known for producing work that has scientific rigor and acumen. And a lot of the retractions come from those highest impact journals, which people do submit their headline grabbing research findings. So it's down to everyone. It's down to researchers. It's down to peer reviewers. Peer review is a difficult one because we're expected to do it in our free time, often unrewarded, and academics have a lot of things to do as it is. And so can we be surprised when peer review is done, in a hurried way and we miss things? And then come the retractions.
Yes, I'll make a follow-up question there. Do you think universities, research science, research institutions should require ethics committee approval for systematic reviews?
That's a really interesting question because that's a real bugbear of mine. I think that's why systematic reviews are seen as such an easy publication, because unlike primary data collection, you can do a systematic review and use the old adage of no ethics was required because we're using published data. But I would argue if you're going to take published data that contains the results of patients that have dedicated their time and health into trials, how ethical is it to do a systematic review which is done in a substandard way and produce a result that is potentially misleading? I say it's not ethical. And I agree. I think it's a really good point. I think there should be some ethical consideration in terms of doing a systematic review. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but it should at least start with being forced to pre-register your intentions somewhere before you start to do it.
Thank you. There's another question. What are your thoughts on umbrella reviews or meta-analysis or meta-analysis? Do they have the same problems? Do they have other problems? What are your thoughts?
They have the same problems. One of the problems that I have is they are often not even done very well themselves. So they are often critiquing systematic reviews, but not even adhering to the methodology themselves. And that's definitely a problem existing already in systematic revolution, and that there aren't the guidelines there yet for overview reviews. That is definitely an emerging field, and there are people working on that at the moment. But one of the main bugbears that I have is that a lot of meta-research articles which are criticizing systematic reviews are not conducted well themselves. They're not pre-registered. They haven't done comprehensive literature searches, and they're not adding anything new. They're just pointing out the same things, which now, as you can see from my living review, has been said many times. So what is the point of just doing another analysis of a sample of systematic reviews and saying they didn't really adhere to the PRISMA guidelines? You know, I would really like the debate to move on a little bit further than that now.
Okay, thank you, Dr. There's, I think I'm gonna tell you a question. Currently there are some artificial intelligence tools that are used to save time in systematic reviews. What do you think would be the consequences of this? Would this be positive? It's a little similar to the first question, but it's
Yeah.
related to time saving. Maybe.
I think, yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic, because if it saves us time, that's great. But I as yet it's such a saturated field, and there's so many different competitors coming out with different tools. It's I think you could view it as having a second reviewer. You know, if it's something that you can use to sense check something, but I would never rely on it. I would always say that the human interpretation and application of the methods has to come first. It's just about how well it can be used to expedite some processes where necessary, but not to replace reviewers, hopefully.
I have a couple of questions on my own. The first is, do you know of any research regarding the quality of systematic reviews included in clinical practice guidelines, and maybe the impact of these reviews? Saying this because there's an overwhelming amount of data from Malaysia, China. Some of these don't have a good quality standards. So, do you know of any research of that? Do you think it's interesting, maybe to explore?
I think it's very interesting. I've definitely seen papers on that, and there are some included in the review. I think it's very interesting because clinical practice guidelines often have panels of people who have conflicts. And so even if they are based on systematic reviews, they might be flawed systematic reviews, or they might be selected systematic reviews. So clinical practice guidelines often add another layer of potential biases after the systematic reviews have been done. And I've definitely seen some papers by John Ioannidis that has highlighted the problems of clinical practice guideline panels, and what evidence they are using to base their very influential decisions on, that really determine a lot of patient care and resource allocation.
And well, one final question is, how can we in low and middle income countries help improve or motivate the research integrity in our countries, region? What do you think it would be different from high-income countries? What should we, where should we start?
I mean, I I think it's, it's a real shame actually that this field is so dominated by the global north and the global west. Um, Particularly when I can see that a lot of the debate is not moving things on. I really hope that this living review gives everyone the opportunity to see where where the field is moving and what needs to be looked at next. And I would really like systematicrevolution.com to become a learning resource for people to actually look at where the gaps are, which areas need more research, and how we can actually understand how the problems impact reviews. And I would encourage those in low and middle income countries to use that resource, which is openly accessible, to learn from a lot of this duplicated conversation and move the debate forward based on those existing studies that we've already found.